Recording on the computer, and we'll hit Audacity in 3, 2, 1.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we have a very special guest who has come back onto the podcast again, Dr. Eric Helms. We are so excited to have you on again and to chat with you today.
It's a pleasure and a privilege. I'm glad to be back. And I think we established it was more than a year ago I was on last time.
Yes, over, I think right around 14 months, which is really, really crazy to say. And we're super excited because as we were just talking about prior to actually recording, your first episode that we did together, which was number 14, is our second most, I know you're shaking your head, but our second most listened to episode.
All I have to say is that Chris Barakat, he's actually a terrible human, no matter what he looks like online. You folks should I want to start a hashtag boycott Chris Barakat's episode campaign. Just don't ask me specifically what he did. It's not worth repeating. It's that bad. But just really, folks, we gotta change we gotta flip the script. We got to start listening to the podcast episodes that are not basically just not Chris Barakat. So I get first. Yeah.
Sounds good.
The beef begins. Here we go. Awesome. So for people who have not listened to episode 14, which is probably a very small percentage of our audience, but maybe for new people coming in, because this will be episode 90, could you just give us a very brief kind of synopsis on who you are and why you are an expert on all things that we're going to talk about today?
Whew. High bar, expert. Sure. Yeah. So I am a dude who started lifting a while ago and really, really liked it. And therefore, you should listen to me. No, but in all seriousness, I fell in love with not only the iron back in 2004, but very quickly I fell in love with the understanding of the science behind it. And also figuring out the nuts and bolts of what improves performance and what improves body composition, improves from the perspective of bodybuilding, of course. Started out as a personal trainer, as any bad personal trainer does. After lifting for a year, I decided, you know what, I'm ready to start training other people. I'm right there with you, right? So, it might have took me another 5 years before I actually started helping my clients, rather than telling them just to do what I did. Oh, you're a 55-year-old woman? That's no different than me as a 21-year-old male. You need to do what I'm doing. But anyway, I eventually learned what the hell I was doing. And that came from a process of study, experience, and also just figuring out what I wanted to do. Pretty early on, I got involved in powerlifting and natural bodybuilding. And I just really, really fell in love with those disciplines of the iron. And I wanted to get into coaching them. So I started competing in 2006 in powerlifting and 2007 in bodybuilding. And then in 2009, I met my brothers from another mother. Well, more than one mother. They're not brothers, but I met Alberto Nunez, Jeff Alberts, and Brad Loomis. We started 3D Muscle Journey. That has greatly expanded now. And essentially, our core mission is to support the drug-free lifting community so that they have sustainable careers in lifting, meaning that they don't burn out, they don't get injured and have to quit, they don't develop body or eating issues that prevent them from competing. And if they do decide to stop, it's on their own terms rather than being forced out by one of those issues. So my role there is I'm the chief science officer. It's kind of what it's evolved into. I used to be one of the coaches as a full-time coach up until about 2013, 14. So in 2012, I had completed a bachelor's and a master's by coursework in the States. I was, still our chief nerd at 3DMJ, but I decided I want to take it further and actually start doing research on my own. And I got the opportunity to start a graduate work program in AUT. That's the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. So I've been here now for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years here in New Zealand where I live in September. And I basically study what I call physique and strength sports science. So I finished my PhD and my second master's here. I've been conducting research since that point. And now I have the great privilege of mentoring other students who are also muscle nerds who come from all around the world to study anything related to strength and physique sport. And over the years, I've developed a few other things that I kind of see as tendrils from 3DMJ. That makes 3DMJ sound like an octopus, but we're going to go with it. And so, yeah, there's monthly applications in strength sport. So I'm involved with the Stronger by Science guys, as well as Dr. Mike Zerdos. And we put out monthly reviews of the research as it applies to this sector. And then I also have some books that Andrew Valdez prompted me to write based upon some videos I did for the 3D Muscle Journey channel. And then we connected with my buddy Andy Morgan, who had a little more experience in putting out digital content at the time. And so kind of fast forward to today, I'm a bit of a science communicator, part-time coach, still an athlete myself, and and researcher.
I love it. I love it. Awesome. So with all of that, what you said is the books, the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. So that is what we went over in episode 14. So if you haven't already listened to that episode, listen to that episode or watched it for the 10 people that watch our stuff on YouTube. You can check that out. And today we're going to be talking about something a little bit closer to the top of the pyramid, meaning you have to have your adherence with your nutrition down. You've got to have your energy balance, your basic food quality, lean proteins, fruits, vegetables, all the basic habits down to really be implementing this kind of stuff, because it is going to require a knowledge of macronutrients, manipulating caloric intake across the week, across the month, all of that stuff. So I did want to just preface us today with, if you have no knowledge of that, we have a lot of episodes on that and we can link them in the show notes. And reading the Muscle and Strength Pyramids can be a really great base for then learning about these tactics and tools that are very valuable when it comes to application and breaking plateaus, preventing plateaus, and seeing fat loss occur. So we're going to talk about refeeds and diet breaks today. So would you like to just kick us off and define what these things are for the listener?
Absolutely. And it'll be cool to talk about this from the scientific perspective, but this is one of those topics that actually originated in the trenches. There's plenty of times where I, as a researcher, or researchers in general, will find out something that, people are doing in the trenches and then study it. And there is also less often where we generate something purely from the literature and our mechanistic understanding, and that gets studied. And both are different and interesting in different ways. An example of the latter would be, discovering that, hey, training at longer muscle length seems to stimulate hypertrophy. And now we've seen some people take that and put it to test in the trenches. And that's a very topical conversation. But other stuff like bodybuilders observing that higher protein diets seem to be better, or this one, that what I would describe as intermittent dieting strategies might help them in certain ways, and even outside of the bodybuilding sector and kind of the mainstream dieting circles, is an example of where we might take something from the trenches and then decide to study it. So there was probably a good place to start is just what have people in the weightlifting bodybuilding community been doing. And refeeds are something that you'll hear relatively commonly today. But I would say in the 90s and before, you'd hear cheat meals or cheat days much more commonly. And it's basically the concept that you eat, quote unquote, clean most of the time, which could mean various things depending on who you talk to and whether you're in the off season or the in season as a competitor. It could mean just not eating certain foods, or it could mean being a little tighter and actually considering your total energy intake. But nonetheless, a cheat day or a cheat meal means that those restrictions are gone, and it typically results in a calorie surplus. And if someone's actually dieting or had been dieting, a pretty big one. If you've ever gotten really, really lean, that's kind of the natural consequence. So anywho, the idea of a cheat meal or a cheat day often was just described as kind of a mental break and a way to kind of just make the diet a little bit easier so that you could have better adherence long term. But there were also some people who were promoting it as a way to actual prompt subsequent fat loss, make the diet more effective. And there's a lot of examples. You can find this throughout the years in the literature. The first time I think I was exposed to it in a more scientific, purposeful way was when I got my ISSA certification way back in 2006, and they described the zigzag diet. I think that was Fred Hatfield who came up with that, the late great. So this has been something that's theorized and postulated about for a long time. I think as it often occurs, when you don't have applied research on something or actually comparing it head to head, and you do have people in the trenches saying this works, you start to look for kind of mechanistic explanations, or, like we look at, oh, look at that. Well, look what leptin does, or look what thyroid does, or, hey, isn't that neat? So, there were some people who were constructing these ideas and kind of connecting the dots of the scant research that exists, looking at mice and petri dishes and acute responses. But it really wasn't until, at least in an athletic or bodybuilding population, I should say, and mimicking the protocols that have been done in the trenches in recent years, it wasn't until the last couple of years that we really had some really good research on this. So the idea of a refeed is simply eating typically at maintenance. And when you talk to bodybuilders about this, there's some good research by Lachlan Mitchell, where he actually qualitatively interviewed some bodybuilders and asked them, tell me about refeeds, basically. The idea is you're eating typically at maintenance. You're often largely increasing carbohydrate intake because of the supposed benefits of that, improving glycogen storage, not being as easily stored as fat, and potentially having a larger impact on leptin and maybe restoring any metabolic adaptation closer to baseline. And it can occur for 1, maybe 2, or even 3 days. And the idea is that you are sustaining a calorie deficit throughout a diet while having these days where you come out of it. So essentially having low and high days. You could do it once a week, twice a week, etc. Probably the most common one for a long time was just having 1 day a week where you'd refeed and you'd back into your deficit. And it would be a similar structure to a normal diet. You would just distribute your calorie deficit across 6 days instead of 7. So you get to have 1 day with a higher intake. And in addition to that, there is the concept that is a little newer of diet breaks. It's sort of newer, but it's sort of not, because this is actually something that got accidentally investigated in the early 2000s, I believe by Wing and Phelan. They wanted to look at people who were messing up on their diet, because that's the biggest barrier, right? Everyone can successfully lose weight, but how often are people able to sustain weight loss? Well, when they go at it alone, not very well, unfortunately. So they tried to experimentally induce quote unquote breaks in the diet, or diet breaks. And it didn't work, because when they asked people to actually step away from this weight counseling group and stop giving them advice to be in a calorie deficit, and it was planned, they didn't actually gain weight. They kind of just plateaued, and they got to the same place that they otherwise would have if they'd stayed on the diet, which is kind of interesting. It promotes the idea of some degree of flexibility and not needing to be on your diet all the time. It was a very applied translational study that wasn't like a metabolic ward. And again, the experimental question was not, can we enhance fat loss or psychological outcomes with diet breaks? But it was an interesting outcome in so much as the researchers expected to observe one thing and they did not. And they started to discuss in the discussion that running yourself into the ground through dieting and then having a binge is a different type of break in the diet than going, you know what, 3 weeks from now, I'm going to eat at maintenance. And or I'm not going to keep dieting. I'm going to go back to a quote unquote normal diet or a maintenance diet. So that concept has been around for, I think, in the fitness industry since the mid 2000s. Refeeds probably a little bit longer in different forms, but I think it's been more popularized in that typical high carbohydrate maintenance 1 time a week approach, probably from around the time when Layne Norton was first popping up onto the scene, so your late 2000s. But believe it or not, we actually haven't had direct research on this stuff again until like the last 3 or 4 years. So yeah, that's where we're at. So we have cheat meals, cheat days. That's go wild, king or queen. Enjoy your day. You've earned it. # self-care, aka binging. And then we have your refeeds, 1 to 3 days at maintenance, and then we have diet breaks, which might be anything longer than 3 days, up to even 2 or 3 weeks, where you're intentionally eating at maintenance before then getting back into a calorie deficit.
I love it. And that's a really great, you answered like a lot of my questions, like as you were going through a lot of that. So that's perfect. We kind of know the history of all of it and how recent a lot of this research is. And I think that's really interesting when, we're thinking about how almost every YouTube video and podcast about refeeds and diet breaks that I've seen in the recent years has been the controversy and all the things about it that are up for debate. And so I guess mechanistically, to kind of explore where that controversy has come from. Originally, I believe when this concept was first brought into play, at least to my awareness, which was probably later than when it was actually first brought into play. But when I first learned about it, it was kind of along the same mechanism that people would advertise cheat days of it's going to revamp your metabolism and it's going to basically make you not adapt to your diet, because that was what was popularized was metabolic adaptation, metabolic damage by Layne Norton for the most part, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's kind of debunk that a little bit. What does the research have to say about refeeds and diet breaks revamping your metabolism?
Yeah, if we want to talk about the actual fat loss advantage, when we look at the mechanistic data, the narratives that were used don't line up. There may be a potential fat loss advantage depending on which strategy you use for different reasons, although it is probably modest, and we should talk about why and make sure we have a correct narrative so it's not used in an inappropriate way. It's still up for debate. We'll get to that. But yeah, the typical narrative is it revamps your metabolism. So, what do you expect when you hear that as a researcher? I'm like, all right, so we're going to measure basal metabolic rate. You're going to have a refeed, and that's going to go up a lot to the point where it's actually driving additional fat loss. Simply put, that doesn't happen. You do get an acute bump in BMR from eating more, but it doesn't outpace the amount you eat. So you might, bring your calories up to even into a surplus, which has actually been studied, even more than maintenance. We put you into a 500, 1,000 calorie surplus. Leptin goes up, awesome, but your energy expenditure might go up 100 calories. So there's not a gaming of the system that seems to be occurring. And that, I think, is an important understanding that kind of has come at the same time as us understanding the term, quote unquote, metabolic damage, which maybe is better said as metabolic adaptation, which, to be honest, even better than that, I like adaptive thermogenesis. And you'll see both of those last two terms in the research. And I like adaptive thermogenesis specifically because it doesn't give you any jargon that makes you think about metabolic rate. Adaptive thermogenesis is just all of the heat output in the body, right? And we measure heat in calories, so think about it as total energy expenditure. So this is adaptations to total daily energy expenditure. And as through the 90s and the 2000s, even until now, we've had a much better understanding that significant components, and in fact, the most adaptable components to our total daily energy expenditure when we diet is actually not metabolic rate. That does shift sometimes, not always. But we see changes in non-exercise activity thermogenesis that change, to a great degree, and a lot more in some people and a lot less in others. Hence the whole spendthrift or thrifty metabolic phenotypes. And there's a lot of things at play that can impact that. Doing more exercise activity can lower your NEAT, even though you're potentially still eating in maintenance. We've seen that through the constrained energy model. So there's a lot of redundant systems and feedback mechanisms at play. So it shouldn't be surprising to people that just simply going like, I had a pizza in the middle of my diet and bam, I lost, more fat mass is not actually the way it works. With that said, and I don't want to jump the gun, I'll let you ask the next question. There are some temporal related, like the timing, even though the net calorie deficit or surplus is the same, the timing of nutrients that can have an impact on physiological mechanisms that might be worthwhile and worth talking about.
Yeah, no, enlighten us on that. I'm actually really curious as to what direction you're going in with this.
All right. So I got pretty interested in this from, to some degree, a maintenance of athlete health perspective. So something that people are only becoming aware of in the last, say, maybe 5-6 years in the bodybuilding sector is a lot of the research on low energy availability, leading to what's called REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. We have typically been focused on the metabolic adaptation, body fat set points, and quantifying the changes in energy expenditure and the difficulty of maintaining weight loss. Because guess what? In the Instagram age of everyone's got to be shredded all the time, we're very focused on like, how much can I eat right now while looking awesome? And what does it do to my body or my performance? And certainly not what it does to my psychology. We don't want to talk about that. Let's keep that under the rug, right? So REDS is basically describing all of the portions of the body physiologically and psychologically that are impacted by not eating enough for your current activity levels. These are the same things that we see when we see quote unquote metabolic adaptation. So metabolic adaptation is simply quantifying the energy expenditure difference between what your predicted energy expenditure should be based on your body weight versus what it actually is following dieting. So you can quantify metabolic adaptation as a couple hundred calories, 200 calories, 300 calories. And when we look at the extremes, when we look at people who are lost 10% of their body weight or more with relatively aggressive methods, we are sometimes seeing a 15% lower energy expenditure than would be predicted. And then when we extend that out to 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations, there are some poor souls who are only burning about 2/3 of the calories they might be expected if based on their body weight. But then it begs the question, how does this happen? And most of the time people just, wave their hands and they say, I have thyroid or something like that. Neat, But there are physiological signals that result in you having a lower NEAT. There's things that are impacting your thyroid output that are impacting systems throughout the body. When we think of the HPA and HPG axes, we think of the parasympathetic nervous system. The initial signal of leptin, it starts to drop as soon as you're in a deficit. It also drops with body fat. So both short-term and long-term energy availability signal to your hypothalamus and can have these wide-reaching effects. And they don't just lower energy expenditure. You feel that. It's kind of like working in a business during a recession. They decide we're going to switch to motion sensor lights. So, you're typing away, it's an office job, and all of a sudden the lights go off, and Tom in accounting has to do this. And guess what? Tom in accounting used to sit next to Susie, but she got fired because they decided they only needed one accountant during this recession because they can't pay her. And guess what? Everyone has to park across the street because they couldn't hire out that parking lot anymore. So we're cutting expenses, but it's affecting the quality of life of the employees. That's essentially the analogy, right? So when you are doing all these things which create this 10, 15, maybe 20% or only 5% reduction in your energy expenditure, you can feel that. It increases sensations of lethargy. It can create depression. It can lower performance. You can see losses in bone mineral density. You can see other body composition changes, losses in lean body mass. And getting back to the original hint I dropped, you can see luteinizing hormone pulsatility change within days in women. And that is what precedes menstrual cycle irregularity, or what is called oligoamenorrhea, eventually leading to amenorrhea, the cessation of the menstrual cycle. And that is, you don't get that, diet-induced amenorrhea without it affecting a whole bunch of other things simultaneously, impacting, core temperature and potentially basal metabolic rate, sleep quality, mental health, all this good stuff, food focus, right? Digestive quality, immune suppression. All of these things are spokes on the wheel of REDS. And as they're downregulated, it has an effect on energy expenditure, right? So the interesting research out there is that you can accrue the same calorie deficit in multiple ways, and you can get that same change in LH pulsatility. So there was 2 different research studies, one where they had women on a pretty large calorie deficit for 5 days, another one where they completely fasted them for 3 days. And they both got to the point where LH pulsatility, because they achieved the same net deficit, started to show signs of dysregulation. And then in one of these studies, they had these women for a single day eat something like 4,500 calories. And these are normal weight women. So a big old refeed, cheat day is probably a better description of it. However, in another study, they had them eat at maintenance, I believe it was either for 2 or 3 days. I can't remember right off the top of my head. This is a study in the 90s. And only in the second protocol did we start to see LH pulsatility return back to normal. And this makes sense when we think about it from an evolutionary biology perspective. If we're long time ago, tribes crossing the Bering Strait, most of us are starved. Not many of the women in the group are going to be having the menstrual cycle. We don't really want to be producing new children when there's no food, making breast milk. That's a very energetically costly scenario, right? So if we come across, one starving mastodon, and I'm sure there are some actual researchers in the area of evolutionary biology and paleontology who are like, listen, the Bering Strait, that's not when they crossed it, and there weren't mastodons. I'm just giving an example. I'm full of shit right now. I'm a sports scientist, but just bear with my my uneducated description of maybe how things were. We come across one starving animal that our tribe eats it. We eat for a day, but then we're back to starving for the next week. It wouldn't be a good idea. It wouldn't be an adaptive mechanism to ramp up our energy expenditure, have kids, everything's great. Oh shit, there's no more food, right? However, if we are getting a sustained increase in calories for multiple days, that does seem to start having an impact on certain aspects of REDS, certain elements of health. So that was something that was honestly more interesting to me than does it really, boost fat loss, because I'm thinking, okay, that probably has an effect on psychology, adherence. It might have a positive effect on training, muscle retention, motivation, and just staying a little more level while dieting, which is a really important thing from my perspective as a bodybuilding coach, where the biggest reason someone doesn't get on stage is because they psych themselves out or they just can't make it because it's just too grueling. So anywho, that was some of the stuff that was really interesting me. And we talked a lot about all of these different disparate pieces of research in a 2019 review paper that we wrote that was myself, Jackson Pios, and a few others. That was titled, if I recall correctly, Intermittent Dieting Theoretical Considerations for the Athlete. And Dr. Pios now, who has finished his PhD, did his entire PhD on the topic of diet breaks and the ideas of intermittent dieting for athletes. And we were really excited at the start of his PhD, and we thought, like you often do at the start of a PhD, this is the solution to all things. This is it's gonna fix every problem. Not even just the problems for the athlete. And that has become, of course, a lot more nuanced. But in that review article, it's super long. We talk about research where you would poll people and say, hey, here's 2 examples, same net deficit for the week, but this day, on this one, you get 6 days at 1,300 calories, and then 1 day at 2,500 calories, or all days at 1,500. And people like the one where they got that one high day. Okay, so it's psychologically preferable. Sweet. We got the studies I cited on LH disruption. Sweet. We've got the stuff showing that it can impact X, Y, and Z. It might replenish glycogen. So we constructed a pretty well-referenced logical argument for, hey, we should research this, and here are the potential benefits. But we haven't observed all of them, certainly.
I think it's really interesting coming from the standpoint of you can have 2 different methods of getting to super low body fat, shredded, like we talked about on Instagram, and you still have the same outcome. So it's like when it comes to how you're going to diet, and so I'm thinking from like, okay, do we want to do these extreme like soup diets, or all you can do, drink is juice for 5 weeks, versus like enjoying your diet a little bit, having a couple refeeds here and there, and then making it to that point, like which would you rather do? So I think that that's really interesting from an application standpoint too.
Totally agree.
Yeah, so that paper that you guys published was theoretical considerations. And then I know that there have been papers in the past couple of years that have come out. Like you said, some of those things have panned out, some of those haven't. And, I think this is where, we can really get into, yes, maybe some of those things have not completely panned out in the research as of yet, maybe ever, but also the benefits of a lot of, like you said, the psychological, the behavioral considerations of why we might implement refeeds, diet breaks for clients. Christina and I mainly work with lifestyle athletes, populations, but also some competitors as well, because I have seen just great benefits psychologically, behaviorally with clients, especially lifestyle clients who just want to live their life on the weekends with refeeds and diet breaks. So yeah, how has that stuff panned out? Like what studies have kind of shifted the tide since you posted that paper?
Yeah. So one of the first that was really interesting was a study by Byrne and colleagues, where what they did is they had a 2-on, 2-off diet break strategy that was relatively well controlled. It wasn't like in a metabolic ward, but they took it wasn't competitors or athletes, but they took individuals with overweight or obesity, and they had them diet for 2 weeks and then go on a diet break period for 2 weeks, and they compared them to a calorie matched group that was on a straight deficit the whole time. So the first most obvious thing was that the study length was 32 weeks for one group and it was 16 weeks for the other to get the same deficit. So that is potentially, depending on your perspective, a big knock on the approach of using diet breaks and refeeds, is that if you need to get to the same deficit, if there isn't this fat loss magic that's going on, this metabolic ramp up, that it will take longer. But I also do question whether that is the way it is felt or perceived, especially for lifestyle clients. For a contest prep athlete, yeah, if I have a 16-week contest prep or a 24-week contest prep, I might feel like I'm in prep mode the whole time and I'm contest prepping, and I might feel like, oh, this is wasted time. I could be gaining in the off season. There's some cogent arguments there as to why you wouldn't want to lengthen prep, even if it made it easier, unless you could justify that it resulted in greater muscle retention or something like that. But for the type of athletes you guys work with, for example, life is continuing, and they may have a large amount of weight loss that they're looking to achieve. So if they're in prep mode for losing 50 pounds or 60 pounds or more, that is, I honestly think that that's likely to fail if we were to run the odds based on the data we have. But I think being able to come in and out of this phase and break it up, and the data I actually do think supports this, seems to indicate that it might be a little bit better. So, and that's exactly what Byrne and colleagues found. So they noticed that not only was there greater body comp or superior body composition changes in the group that did the diet breaks, they also noticed, so one other finding was that it seemed to be that the fat-free mass corrected metabolic rate was a little bit better or higher in the group that did the refeeds versus the non-refeed group. And there's some dispute around that data point and how it was calculated. So I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it. But I think the most interesting thing was that I think it was a 6-month follow-up, more weight loss was retained in the group that did diet breaks. And what they were asked to do was simply to eat at maintenance for these 2 weeks. Food was provided, and they had measurements taken in a pretty controlled conditions. But it was mostly an outpatient study. So we can't assume that the fat loss advantage came from something mechanistic due to the changes to the nutrition or the fact that they had a diet break. But if it improved their adherence, that would explain it. And that does seem to comport with their follow-up data, which suggests, hey, these folks were able to maintain weight loss more effectively long-term, at least in the longest term that they measured in the study. So that's probably the first thing that really caught my eye. I reviewed this in mass, I want to say in 2019. Could be wrong on that year, but good study by Byrne and colleagues. Really interesting. And I think to switch from scientist hat to practitioner hat, I think the way this is framed is very important. If it is framed like, oh, you've been so restricted, now it's time to just cut loose for 2 weeks, that can probably cause issues. And that's not what happened in the study, right? They were instructed and guided and given advice on how to eat at maintenance and checked on that, right? So I think another way to look at this is to say, hey, this might feel tough. You've been on a 2,000 calorie diet. You're used to eating 3,000 calories when you first came to me to work with me. And now we're going to go to, say, 2,600 calories for a couple of weeks. That's going to feel a whole lot less crappy than 2,000. And it's going to prompt different behaviors. Different foods are going to fit into your calorie budget. You can be looser in some areas, but still a little more controlled in others. Let's figure out what behaviors match up with these new quantitative guidelines, if you're using quantitative guidelines. In this example, I am, to accomplish this period of maintenance. It's essentially practicing eating in your new body with your new behaviors as you're dropping weight over time. And I think it gives the person an opportunity to see the quote unquote light at the end of the tunnel. I think many times people think that they have to basically stay on a diet to stay lean or to maintain weight loss long term, when in reality, they're assessing how they feel on a deficit. And the food choices that are available, the social sacrifices they have to make, the lethargy, whatever they're feeling, whatever they're experiencing, can be eased a bit when they just simply have more of a budget to play with, and getting the opportunity to practice that. I think based on the findings by Byrne and some of the other studies that were done subsequently by Pius and myself and others, indicate that it can improve adherence and it can make a diet a little more sustainable from a mental perspective.
Yeah, I think you put that very, very well with just how it's framed, especially because of, we talked about the origins of refeeds and diet breaks literally coming from cheat meals and cheat meal culture. And so If somebody has been around long enough and maybe they're in their 5th decade of yo-yo dieting, what are they going to think when somebody says, have a diet break, have a refeed? So I think just being very intentional with saying, hey, so we're going to do this thing, and it is not a free pass. Here you go eat whatever you want. Can we be a little bit more flexible? Yes. But it's important that we stay regimented in this way because we want to see the benefits from this. I've seen situations in my past where I have not articulated this correctly, and I've had a diet break turn into I use all my extra carbs for 4 glasses of wine every night, and the rest of my diet stays exactly the same. We're not going to get the same benefits that way. Like, sorry. Maybe they're more relaxed, but that was about it. But yeah, so like you said, preferentially increasing carbohydrates and benefits from that for people who I think, and it's also important to consider if you are working with a type of client who can internalize that appropriately. So there might be a type of person, I'll say person A and person B. Person A says, yeah, I'm on board. I'll just increase my portions of sweet potato and rice cakes. Maybe I'll have a cookie on Friday and I'm good. And we will practice maintenance. And this is what my life could look like a year in the future when I've lost all 50 pounds or whatever it is. But you also have person B who has a history of the all or nothing mindset, a history of really, when restrictions are removed, taking it too far, where I think that there's other things that need to be addressed first, where they can't really internalize the additional flexibility as well. And putting a refeed or a diet break into the plan might feel for them like permission to go off track and ultimately just stall the diet.
Absolutely. And there's support for what you're saying. If we look at the average American who attempts weight loss, over their life, they'll have 13 to 14 attempts. So the likelihood that they will have had yo-yo dieting history is high if they're coming to you for weight loss guidance, if you're a trainer or a nutritionist, right? We also know that as much as I really do think flexible restraint is a much better way to go, lower the likelihood of developing eating disorders, disordered eating patterns, and just improve the likelihood that you're able to lose weight and keep it off long term. We aren't 100% sure on how to, quote unquote, prescribe flexible restraint. Because indeed, when we actually look at people attempting to diet, we see that flexible restraint and rigid restraint share a lot of variance. Now, you can mathematically control for that variance and separate it, and you can see the benefits of flexible restraint. But how often do you tell someone exactly what you just said? We're going to try to use a quote unquote flexible strategy, but they implement it in a very black and white way. You know, I want you to track macros, and then you get the spreadsheet, and they're hitting the macros within a gram every day. Or they track macros and only eat a list of 6 foods. Or they will never go out to eat without bringing their food scale, because I'm no way I'm going to eyeball that. I might be off by a few grams. So people can take what we would describe as flexible dieting constructs and concepts and absolutely apply them in extremely rigid ways. So the delivery is extremely important. So when I use this in non-competitors, and even sometimes in competitors, I'm not thinking about let's jump your carbs up. I'm saying, hey, let's just hit this calorie target. You got a new budget, you know, and let's talk about some of the things like, you know, so this you might go, okay, I think I can actually work in eating out. Sweet. Let's talk about, because you haven't eaten out more than say once every couple of weeks on this current diet plan. How do we navigate that? You know, what are some of the choices you'd make? Where would you go? How do we account for the potential variability? I really don't think the chef is back there making sure that what they make matches what it says in the menu for the calorie count. So what are we going to do? What are some eyeballing skills? Let's talk about, you know, our fist and our thumb and our deck of cards and all the eyeballs of portion sizes. And let's think about rating our hunger and satiety a little bit and being aware that it could be modified. There's some other tools I give to someone before I send them off into the wild with a diet break. You know, I make sure that they're comfortable. And ideally, the timing of the diet break is not when they're just barely hanging on like cliffhanger with one pinky ready to fall into the crevasse. but more so they're just maybe just starting to feel a little bit of diet fatigue, and the response is typically the way I implement them, people who are dieting, is, I don't think I need a diet break, coach. And I'm like, that's fine. Good. Like, we don't, like, we're not trying to burn ourselves out. We got some good productive fat loss in. Let's take a break. Awesome. Let's see what it's like now that you're 5 kilos lighter. So I think that the timing and the method of implementation, and also, like you said, Marissa, making sure it's the right person. Some of these folks should not even be dieting, and making sure that there is the behavioral and mindset underlying foundation to support this, I think, is critically important. And unfortunately, a lot of people who seek out diet advice probably need to go through some type of non-dieting strategy and deal with some of those issues first, and maybe adopt more non-weight related healthy behaviors initially before, if they ever decide to start going down the weight loss route. Because there's so much we can do to promote physical activity, incorporating more micronutrient dense foods in their diet, creating just more structure in their lives, making them enjoy or helping them enjoy some type of exercise. All of these things are super, super important. Improving a sleep schedule, helping them set, psychological and mindfulness practices in place, improving their relationships with their family, helping them to be a little less codependent. Like, there's a ton to be done that doesn't require them to start losing weight. And all of those things could potentially short circuit their weight loss efforts. So I think it's important to identify that. And it's a difficult thing to do when you're a personal trainer. Maybe you're a well-educated personal trainer, and someone comes to you and says, I want to lose weight, and they pay you, and you go, okay, and maybe the only thing that you would say 10 years ago have done and be like, well, if they're really, really lean already, then I'm concerned that maybe they have an eating disorder and I don't want to help them lose weight. But if someone is, BMI classification 25 or higher, and they haven't done exercise for a while, it seems like, oh, this is a great candidate. But there's so much more to it than that. It's unfortunate that we, as trainers, typically don't have the skill set to assess. So that's a whole other podcast. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But that is how I implement in certain populations the diet break concept or refeed concepts, which is similar, just a shorter time frame. If I'm talking to a competitor, I almost don't use the term like diet break. Like, we're going to eat a maintenance for a week. This is an athlete, right? Our goal is to compete in X number of weeks. These are our current numbers. Say it's 150 grams of carbs and 40 grams of fat and 175 grams of protein. We're digging hard. We got 6 days of cardio. Okay, now the goal next week is we're going to do 2 days of cardio, and we're going to add 100 grams of carbs to all days. Then that's the change. It's not something totally different. We aren't, turning over a leaf. We're not practicing maintenance. It is what we think is best for you to get on stage at your best in the time frame we have. And I think the messaging there is different. I still do implement it before they're absolutely struggling or dying, unless they're a pretty experienced competitor who I know that something like turning into a binge is a low likelihood of happening. And it's something I also discuss collaboratively in both examples of client. So yeah, delivery is incredibly important. And I think you can potentially cause issues if you don't know how to deliver these things, if you're just looking at the X's and O's.
I love your practitioner hat. Not that I don't love your science too, but I think it, like you were saying, you could have two competitors or even just two lifestyle clients, and just based on their psychology and what they're presenting, you can approach them in very, very different ways. And I also like that, we've been talking about diet breaks and refeeds and cheat days and how they can be beneficial. But like you were just saying, is that sometimes it's not based on certain people. And I think that you were on a podcast with Eric Trexler, and he was like, I use them for clients, but personally, I don't use them. I just like to keep it simple, and that's just what works best for me. And I had a client recently who we were using diet breaks refeeds. And while they were on paper, they were looking great, she said, I actually don't like this, even though I do see an additional jump on the scale, like for weight loss. The big bump after having it, like 2 days later, she's like, it just freaks me out, and I just don't know if the fat loss is going to come, and so I just don't want to do them anymore. So I was like, cool. Even though they're working, we'll pull them out, because psychologically, like, that could cause a lot more issues down the road. So I think it's very interesting. And if you are listening to this podcast and, you're like, okay, I know that diet breaks and I know refeeds might be beneficial, but I just don't feel like they work for me. That's totally fine too.
Yeah.
100%.
You made me think of a client I had who, and he's like a recreational bodybuilder, basically. Like he's not competing, but he takes it basically just as seriously. He gets annoyed at refeeds, and I would program them in for a while, and he'd be like, this again? And then sometimes he would just deliberately not take it. And I'd be like, hey, you missed your refeed day. And he'd be like, yep, I know. And so kind of had to learn to live with that. And I think as a coach, it's just being able to adjust, like, okay, if this is not the type of person for that, we reallocate the deficit across the 7 days then. And, that person is A-okay with that. But yeah, no, I wanted to just circle back really quickly and just say how much I appreciate everything you said about, okay, yeah, we're at the top of this pyramid and we're talking about macro manipulations and refeeds and diet breaks and all these little benefits that can benefit a fat loss phase. But something that we've really, really honed in on, I think I can speak for Christina and I both, is, does this person have foundational skills before they try anything with a macro, with flexible restraint, with rigid restraint, because they can show up so differently. And I think one thing that really does change the course of whether or not tracking someone's macros shows up as flexible restraint or rigid restraint. And if you are unsure of what those things are, rigid restraint is like a black and white mindset. You're kind of, all or nothing. Flexible restraint is a very, I would say, healthier approach to flexible dieting, tracking macros, and a more balanced mindset around it. I think one of the things that really contributes to which path you go down is what that foundation looks like prior to implementing that skill. And so I think it's really important that these skills that we're talking about and these tools that we're talking about today can and should be utilized in certain contexts. But if you're listening to this and you're not there yet, that's okay. And oftentimes, a lot of the skills that Eric mentioned, like taking care of your sleep, managing your stress better, mindfulness practices, exercising in a way you enjoy, eating more micronutrient dense foods, guess what? Those things are probably going to result in weight loss too, if you have extra weight to lose. And you might find that when you focus on those things instead of, how do I get scale down? I need to do these refeed things that they're talking about. Like, if we just focus on our life and improving that, we often end up getting the result that we want when we have stopped focusing on it. So I just wanted to say I very much appreciated that, because that's been a big focus, I think, of both of ours lately.
Glad to hear it. And I appreciate being appreciated. I think it's good to know that I can be helpful, not just from explaining the data perspective, but also talking about the implementation. And going back to something that you both said, talking about individual clients and whether or not they can exhibit what I would describe as flexible control versus rigid control. This is something that it's not an abstract concept. Like, there's a thing called the 3-factor eating questionnaire. You give it to someone in this research, they take it, and then you can get a score for flexible restraint and rigid restraint. And so, for example, one of the things that defines flexible restraint is your ability to just adjust based upon the social situation. Oh, a friend came out of town. I'm comfortable eating a little bit higher when I went out to eat, and tomorrow I'll eat a little bit less, right? Comfortability with the idea of having a variable energy intake. And both of the client examples you guys described is someone who's not there yet, or may not get there, and that's okay. So that person would probably score high on rigid restraint, or higher. And so if you know that about yourself or about a client, that you get anxiety, you get stress, or you trend towards extremes when you introduce variability, and auto-regulating your energy intake is something that is scarier rather than something that provides you more options and flexibility. By introducing it, you would be doing the opposite of what you're intending, right? So sure, logically on paper, these things are supposed to promote flexibility, increase adherence, and enable you to incorporate more behaviors and foods into an otherwise restrictive diet and still get you to the same place with the same amount of deficit and fat loss. But it has to actually operate that way for you to get the benefits from it, right? So yeah, if that ain't you, I would say don't just say, oh, I'm not a refeed person. Like, don't put yourself in a box. I would say have a growth mindset and go, oh, maybe that's something I should work on, because that's probably not the type of person who is described by someone who has lost a lot of weight and maintained it long term. Now, if you're a competitive bodybuilder, it matters a little bit less because you shouldn't be trying to maintain like stage shape. So, if you get a little anxious when you're 10 pounds over shredded and you want to more tightly control your stuff, okay, that's fine. I mean, you're half starved. You're far below what is probably a healthy body fat level for you and sustainable anyway. We don't want to sustain that, and that's okay. In my own 2019 prep, I wasn't tracking at all for the first half of it. And then basically just out of anxiety and better safe than sorry, I started tracking more rigidly as I got deeper into prep. But, when you're 6 foot and you compete at like 175, 176 pounds, yeah, I mean, of course it was crazy at the end. Like, right. That's unless I was an endurance athlete, that's not the appropriate weight for someone of my size. That is a shredded weight. And that comes with outcomes that are less than ideal for mental health that we accept as competitors. So anyway, definitely differs by the individual. And I think you really have to apply this and tailor it. And I'm glad you brought up the pyramid. I think basically the way to think about it from a hierarchical perspective is, okay, if we're just basically below supplements as far as the potential efficacy that we can get out of this, and we've got things like behavior and lifestyle, calorie intake, which is basically the total net deficit that you're at, macronutrient intake, that are below us. If doing something here modifies one of these things in a negative way, it's not worth it, right? That's the whole basis of the hierarchy. So that's essentially the way you use the pyramid sometimes, is if you start implementing strategies that are higher up and it subverts the intentions of more foundational strategies, don't do it. It's not working. So, yeah.
Yeah. You made me think of intermittent fasting when you said that, because it's like meal timing, 4-hour window to eat. Does it impact your quality of life? Maybe. So should you do it? Who knows?
Hey, can you go out to eat? Yes, if it's within the 4 hours after I train. What time do you train? 2 p.m. There's what? Okay, yeah. Cool. I'm going to call someone else.
So no brunch ever.
Right. Correct.
I do want to summarize a little bit, because we did get, I think, a lot of it into the weeds with refeeds, diet breaks, and exactly what benefits are we talking about, and just what can and can't we expect, and then just kind of getting into tactical strategies that our audience could use if they are clients, if they are coaches, to implement these things. And so my little list here, I just want you to let me know if I'm missing anything, but basically, if we were to implement I'm going to just talk about refeeds first, and then diet breaks, we'll extend that out. But if we were to implement a 1, 2, 3 day refeed, we can most likely experience one, being able to practice what our life might look like after the diet. I think that for diet breaks is one of the biggest benefits, in my opinion, for lifestyle clients. And like you said, being able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Number 2, potential muscle retention. I know the research on this is maybe not, because of how water is retained in body composition testing. But even so, if we retain more water and glycogen in our muscle, we might perform better in the gym, and therefore retain more muscle in our diet, therefore keeping our body composition as best we possibly can as we lean out. My favorite with refeeds, and personally when I have these myself, energy output changes in non-exercise activity. So am I more likely to do the laundry and the dishes when I have a refeed day? Absolutely. Am I going to do that when I'm deep into 5 days of dieting and on a low day? Absolutely not. So psychologically, being able to output more calories when you have a refeed day or 2 or 3 in the gym, in your life, and therefore accelerate your fat loss by not having these big chronic dips in your energy expenditure, which is basically the summary of my 2018 contest prep, which was when I thought I knew about this, but I didn't. And then potentially LH pulsatility if we are doing consecutive refeeds, which may mitigate some hormonal changes deep in a diet. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, potentially.
Yeah, potentially.
Want me to go into depth on some of these, or you got more on your list?
My list is just don't expect drastic changes in BMR or magic fat loss. But yeah, go ahead, elaborate.
No, absolutely. It's a great list. I agree with it. And to expand on some of those points, if people are curious, so what was that about? Lean mass retention. Yeah. So Campbell and colleagues, great study out of Dr. Bill Campbell's lab at University of South Florida. They actually observed in resistance trained individuals following two calorie matched plans. They were outpatient, of course, but probably people who were having a high level of adherence, resistance trained. So now we're looking at reasonably lean people trying to get leaner. So a little closer to maybe the more fitnessy population, and certainly closer to bodybuilding. Those who had just a 7-day deficit compared to those who had a larger deficit on 5 days and then 2 days at maintenance didn't retain as much dry fat-free mass, which was essentially a corrected value where they looked at changes in DEXA corrected by total body water from BIA. And the reliability of that specific metric, I haven't seen it gauged, but I think it's a pretty good indicator where they tried to control for water and they still saw a difference in fat-free mass retention. That's not necessarily muscle. We can't make too large of assumptions about that. Would have been great to see like muscle thickness or cross-sectional area in that study, but it's an overall good sign, I would say. And there weren't between group differences, but there were pre versus post differences that showed slightly better retention of energy expenditure in the group with the refeeds, if I recall correctly. But anyway, again, not large enough to really be super meaningful in that case, but potential body composition favoring the refeeds. Now, what's confusing though, and should I jump into? I won't jump into diet breaks yet, but I will say, yeah. As far as the other things, we could probably expect improved performance during a 1-week diet break. POS, and I was part of this as well, showed that muscular endurance was better in a group during a diet break than during not, which is pretty unsurprising when you think about it. Whether that is worth it, though, because then you're going to be in a deficit at other times, and does that 1 week of enhanced performance, is the juice worth the squeeze? It depends. If you were an athlete who has to lose weight to make weight for a competition, and then you increase calories during harder phases of training, you might be able to pair those up in a way that is a little better than just having a straight deficit, surely. If you are an athlete like a bodybuilder who benefits from having more glycogen and the visual potential impacts, which have now been shown of carbohydrate loading, of looking better, then there's something there. And that's actually something that I think is really useful from refeeds that is not talked about and is not relevant, so it shouldn't be talked about in more general dieting populations. But the way we use refeeds at 3DMJ as trial runs for peak week, we know what you look like after 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 days of high carbohydrate intake and maintenance compared to low days. And this can give us a lot of insight. So even if you're a first-time competitor, if we look at, say, your last 4 or 5 weeks when you're in pretty good shape before your show of using a refeed-based strategy, I have a better idea of when do you have kind of a more spilly look, at what point do you spill over, how long does it take for carbohydrates to seat. I just have to get the data from you. I have to ask for videos on a slightly more regular basis and in certain temporal points around when you're having your refeeds. And that can inform the actual peak week strategy to the point where we're eliminating the possibilities of something going really, really wrong. Even if we do something conservative and we just manipulate where your refeeds are, shift calories on a little more, or we take what you did and we're slightly more aggressive or slightly less aggressive, depending on what we've seen historically. So that's a nice little tangential benefit that is relative to a very small population of people, but pretty critical if you're in that population. And then, we don't have, what I really want to see, Marissa, is a study where we have an equal deficit, but we use an intermittent strategy versus a straight, linear strategy, and we look at the occurrence rates of oligomenorrhea, menstrual cycle disruptions, and amenorrhea in women. I would not be surprised if we saw a potential advantage of taking an intermittent approach based upon the research I cited earlier. And also there's a case study of a drug-free figure competitor by Halliday and colleagues that actually looked at the recovery period. And it took this woman 3 or 71 weeks for her menstrual cycle to come back. So yeah, that's a year and a half. Despite the fact that she actually regained weight back to where she was previously, where she had a menstrual cycle. And when you read the discussion, this is, again, I don't have hard data on this. They talk specifically about how she followed a very conservative approach, kept things under control, kind of sounded like a reverse diet. And at least in my experience with practice, when people try to reverse diet, there are these blips that happen where they have a day where they binge and then they come back down. So I do wonder if they were coming in and out of an energy deficit that resulted in a net energy surplus and they gained weight, but that it was actually not allowing them to have a consistent energy surplus enough to kind of kickstart their menstrual cycle again and get back to a normal LH pulsatility pattern. So I don't know. That's again observational N of one, but the mechanism is there. It potentially was observed that that was a less than ideal approach. Could be something else going on, so I'm not making any firm claims, but I think that is important research to do moving forward. And some of the research I've done in the discussions on bodybuilders, some of the stuff I've done with Chappelle and colleagues, we've talked about, hey, you know, when energy availability gets too low, which is something you can actually calculate as your energy intake minus exercise expenditure divided by lean body mass. When that gets too low, that's when you start to see lean body mass losses observationally, and that's what leads to REDS. You can either look at that on a day-to-day basis, or you can look at that big picture, and you can manipulate that by just dieting slower, or potentially taking an intermittent approach so that you don't spend too much time in too low of a energy availability. So basically, I'm interested in seeing the effects of manipulating the strategy to see if you can ward off symptoms of REDS for a longer time period, so that they start to accumulate and you can put them at bay, even if it doesn't necessarily enhance performance. It might enhance or mitigate some of the negative effects, the transient negative effects on health.
Yeah. And I think it really comes down to, what is a person's priority in a diet. I know some women don't give a crap when they lose their period, and maybe that's not the best mindset to have around it, but they're like, just
can I say I don't think it's the best mindset? Because
probably
some are like,
not.
yeah, sweet, I don't have to deal with it. It's like, that's not happening in isolation. That's not the only thing. There may be losses in bone mineral density. There may be effects on your immune system. So the way I like to frame it, Marissa, is that it's a unique feature, not a bug, that we can actually track that, because there's not an equivalent in men. It's very subjective. Like, how's your libido? Like, how lethargic are you? Like, we can get some blood work done, but to see your menstrual cycle get disrupted, that's essentially because it's being impacted by the same mechanism, that hypothalamic control of the multiple systems, where we know if that is being disrupted, it's almost assured that other elements of it are as well. So it can be a nice way of going, oh, like we missed a couple months, let's take a diet break. For a guy, it's kind of like, how you doing? So I think it's I think it is something to pay attention to and potentially use as a regulation strategy.
Yeah, it's like a temperature check of like, how are we really doing? Because a lot of times you can feel fine dieting. And maybe that's not the case physiologically, and maybe it's a harder time dieting than you thought. And so no, great points there. So kind of getting into, to wrap us up, some tactical, like, here's situations, scenarios, things that we recommend you use these strategies for, that you don't use them for. My mind immediately jumped to the same client who I said got annoyed when I gave him refeeds. Finally got an excuse to use a diet break, because this man wants to diet constantly. He hates gaining body fat. Definitely would score high on the rigid restraint, but I love the guy. He's great. And he's a really hard worker. But he said he dieted down for a photo shoot, had that last week, and then he has a family vacation to his home country for 2 weeks. And he was like, I need some flexibility here. And I was like, that's the first time I've ever heard you say that. Great, let's do it. And so we're implementing a diet break for those 2 weeks. Is it always the best idea to schedule that for a vacation? Like you said, is it like, are they hanging on the ledge of binging every day? Maybe not. But in this case, I think it was very well understood of, here's what we're going to do. And it's a trip, not necessarily a vacation. He's like, I got my gyms laid out. I'm going to have everything in place. Like, I need a little more flexibility. So I think that's a great example of a situation to use a diet break. We're doing it for 2 weeks, I believe, a little over 2 weeks. So it'll be a nice time for him to practice maintenance and give his body a break. And hopefully, you know, I think the one thing I really like to emphasize when it comes to using these strategies is people get so scared when we talk about refeeds and diet breaks of, oh, higher calorie days, I'm going to gain weight. Will you see a spike on the scale? Maybe. Your muscles are going to hold water weight. They absolutely will. But you got to remember that most of the time, unless we are intentionally using surplus days for our refeeds or surplus days for our diet breaks, usually it's maintenance. What is maintenance? It's not a surplus. So at no point are we actually entering a net surplus for a week or a month if we are implementing a diet break for a week or two or a refeed for a day or two in the week. And so that's a reminder I always like to give people with this and with reverse dieting. It's like we're working our way up to maintenance. We're at maintenance. We're not above it. So we're not going to be gaining fat in this situation. So I think it's a good reminder for people, for that client in particular. Absolutely. But yeah, so when you are using these strategies, know that you don't have that really to fear when you're implementing these in your week or your month.
Yeah. And there are some other nice little tangential things like I noticed that refeeds and diet breaks keep me regular. This might be TMI, but if you think about how often people experience GI distress and constipation while dieting, it's not uncommon. That is one of the symptoms of REDS, but you know, for some goals, you don't get to not get into a state of low energy availability. You have to deal with this stuff. And your energy intake and even carbohydrates specifically stimulates the GI tract. So if you think about it, like, okay, I use a linear strategy. Instead of being on 1,300 calories every day, I'm on 1,500. That's probably not going to move the needle. However, if you have a day at 2,500 calories, at least in my case and in a lot of clients' cases, you tend to, let's just say you backload your BMs, you know, for the week. And I sometimes in certain stages of prep or with certain clients, I actually know that we're going to get to see the weight loss that occurred after the refeed period on the weekends, especially if it's a 2-day, because their body weight stays flat and even starts to climb throughout the week as they're having few enough bowel movements that that is masking their fat loss. And they may even be stressed and having water retention as well. There's a natural effect of being in a calorie deficit that cortisol is higher. So these various mechanisms can result in just the scale weight being a little more confusing. And for some clients, yeah, that isn't happening. So what happens when they refeed? They gain a little bit of weight. But for a lot of other clients, and I would even say maybe half, people filter into both of these in my experience, you will actually see weight loss, at least for a certain period of time following refeeds, as some of that water weight dissipates and things start moving along more naturally, if you will.
Yeah, I found that even the same person, different points in a diet, that can vary as well. You know, maybe they're not quite as lean yet and they're just, you know, gaining weight on the refeed and not anywhere else, because maybe they're not at that low calorie end of the diet phase yet where they can still go to the bathroom. And just FYI, we talk about poop plenty on this podcast, so you're fine. And then, you know, especially in say a contest prep or someone's really lean, you know, we see that increase of constipation through the week, and then we go after the weekend and we're back down, and we maybe just gauge based on what's our lowest lows of that week. What's that telling us, instead of all the constipation that you are literally texting me about every day as a client. Because I remember when I was in contest prep, that was a very it was on my mind a lot. So
and then you start focusing on it and you're like, maybe I'll just stay in bed for another few minutes and see if that'll, you know, be better, and then I'll check the scale. And it's like, sometimes you just got to kind of have a little self-intervention and be like, I need to stop thinking about this so much, because certainly this level of obsession is not making my anxiety about pooping any better.
How few sips of coffee can I have to go to the bathroom without gaining weight from the coffee before I weigh myself?
Yep. That's when you know you're a little too attached to the scale and forgetting what it represents, you know, which is all things, right? So yeah, it is there is a lot of psychology that goes into a lot of this. And I think it's really important to talk about it so the coach understands that they don't subvert the big picture by trying to get some of this minutia in place. Marissa, is it worth me venturing into the diet break kind of final stuff to contrast with the refeeds?
Yeah, I think so. And then
cool.
We'll wrap it up after that.
All right, I'll be pretty quick because it's pretty straightforward. So, like I mentioned earlier, I dropped the seed of now Dr. Pios and the research he did, and yes, we did find like for during a week your performance improves. But interestingly enough, the research that that Pios did that I was a part of and privileged to be a part of, it didn't find that same fat-free mass retaining effect that was observed in Campbell and colleagues, which is probably why Jackson actually wrote a letter to the editor about Campbell's. And that's where some of that controversy comes from. I mean, it was nothing wrong with Campbell's study. He did just point out like, hey, the only difference between groups was this dry fat-free mass thing. And, is that enough? Is that water? There's somewhat of a question mark there. But ultimately, that study did find better dry fat-free mass retention. However, you would think if a 2-week diet, refeed would do that, why wouldn't we also observe it with a 2-day, refeed would result in fat-free mass preservation? Why wouldn't we see that with a 1-week diet break? And that was the model that Jackson used for his research. Instead of the 2v2, like 2-1, 2 off, like Byrne and colleagues did, like, all right, what's more practical for the athlete? How about 3 and 1? So recruited a bunch of athletes, had them train. They were very diligent. It's great to have athletes as participants in this study. And what we did not observe was better fat-free mass retention. And the performance effects were pretty much restricted just to the period of the diet break. So this does throw some conflicting results, if you will, with Campbell. So it's kind of a question mark right now if collectively these intermittent dieting strategies will enhance fat-free mass retention. When we go all the way from Byrne till now, it's neutral to positive, as I like to say, in terms of the way we look at it. But what Jackson did find in his research was that satiety and acceptability of the diet were better using diet breaks. So at the very least, that wasn't measured necessarily in Campbell, but there is no data right now that shows that these diet breaks cause psychological problems. So that's not even neutral to positive, it's just positive. So that is probably where you can, if you were going to bet on the outcomes of future research, that's where you'd put your money, is on the potential psychological benefits. And yeah, I think a lot of those other aspects that have not yet been explored, like sleep, anxiety, bowel movements, what you physically actually look like in response to these things, they might get researched in the future, but they have not yet. And then another really big final hurdle that we need to investigate is looking at extremely lean people, because these athletes were athletes, they weren't physique competitors. And we've talked about low energy availability, which is really just a function of how low are your calories. But just like you discussed, when someone is leaner, that is somewhat of a different ballgame. The amount of food you eat does have a direct impact on leptin, but 70%-ish of what predicts your circulating leptin levels is your adipose tissue level. So if you get lean enough, yeah, you can eat at maintenance every day, but you're still going to, between meals, and when you're not in a postprandial state, which is most of the time, you're going to be circling the drain in terms of your circulating leptin levels, which is going to then have that knock-on effect on the hypothalamus, which is going to leave those symptoms of REDS and adaptive thermogenesis and all of the other negative things that we experience with dieting persistent until you put on at least what is an appropriate level of adipose tissue back for you. So yeah, I think to some degree, we're exploring strategies that are intended to mitigate metabolic adaptation. But if we're using people who aren't super, super lean, who are following moderate diets, as Eric Trexler likes to put it, it's like testing the effect of bee repellents when there's no bees around. Of course, it doesn't do anything. Maybe not, of course, but it would be great to see people, look at the effects of contest dieting athletes for the stage, physique competitors, and look at, different phases of, say, a 20, 24, 36 week prep or however long it is, and see if these strategies have differential effects. And that's a really high bar of evidence to clear. Very challenging to ask a bunch of bodybuilders, hey, let me mess with your diet to see if it works better or not. You're not going to get a whole lot of absolutely, responses to that. So we may never get that research, but I think it's important just to acknowledge what we have not studied. And that is actually one of the populations that most religiously uses this, and anecdotally seem to get benefits from it. So I think there's a relatively large question mark there. So anyone who is stating really definitively either pro or con that refeeds and diet breaks do or don't work for populations we have not studied, like competitive bodybuilders, just know that that's their opinion rather than something backed by data.
Yeah, that's very true, because those are the populations where, you know, we're really looking at it like, okay, all your hormones are jacked at this point. So is everything else reliable from all the research that we have? So yeah, no, I love that point. And I think there was one takeaway that I had. Oh, right. The takeaway.
I have something actually that you said earlier that I wanted to like big up you on. Your client who is doing an auto-regulated kind of like, hey, I'm going on a trip, I would like to do a diet break. I think that is a great strategy for both refeeds and diet breaks. Like their whole purpose and the thing that we have the most confidence in their positive effect is from adherence and improving diet acceptability. So there's nothing wrong with just having a linear diet and just setting your deficit and going after it, and then using refeeds as a strategy when social situations occur or when trips occur, using diet breaks, just to set yourself up for success. Like instead of going, all right, let me figure out what I need to do when my old college friend is coming to town for this weekend. It's like, no, we're not going to try to diet through your friend coming here. Let's put you at maintenance here, and then we'll just make that up over the next 7 days, you know? Or, hey, you're going on a family trip. We're not going to try to diet and ruin the trip and get you divorced. We're going to have you actually enjoy your time there and give you an extra 700, 800 calories every day while you're there. And I think that is a really, really useful approach to this, is that they are tools in the tool belt that you get out when you need to use them, rather than necessarily always being inbuilt to every plan that you create.
Yeah, I think that's important, that it's not just a proactive tool of, you know, we do this once a week, every week, all the time, and, you know, there we go. But rather for those people that maybe don't love that fluctuation, just when we need it. And yeah, that's really important. And what I was going to say as a takeaway was, okay, research on refeeds, diet breaks, neutral to positive so far. In contest prep situations, you know, question mark. But when we factor in anecdotal evidence, behavior, psychology, preference, if it is a preference for somebody to have that, then we know we have just a big check mark there to use that strategy. And there's probably going to be less downside to trying that out versus not. And then on the flip side, if you are going to use it as a tool when you need it, making sure you're not that person B who is going to say, yeah, I just use refeeds when I need it, meaning I just go off track every other weekend.
Well said. I totally agree. Those are great takeaways.
Well, I feel like we could definitely continue talking for another few hours. And I think that this was a really, really great topic. And I'm going to probably have to go back and re-listen, because there's just so many little nuggets. And we'll make sure that we have a super good clickbait for the title, so this skyrockets to #1. And I'm going to be interested to see if you have the same response to the last question. Marissa, do you have anything else before we wrap up?
No, I'm just trying to think of what the clickbait would be, because originally the title was just going to be refeeds and diet breaks, but
no, this needs to be #1. So, but it's
why your diet fails with Eric Helms.
Why Eric says your diet is failing. But we always ask our guests this question, and so it's going to be interesting to go back and hear your response at 14 versus now and see if anything has changed. But we always ask our guests, if you had to give someone your #1 tip for someone who wants to live a healthy and sustainable lifestyle, what that would be.
I don't remember what I said last time.
That's the point, I think.
That's good. So just to see how random my mind is. I would say find some type of physical activity that you enjoy, that is motivating in and of itself or enjoyable in and of itself, just the process, the practice of it, without worrying about the outcomes. and let yourself fall in love with it and do it as much as you want, and hopefully a lot. So I think some type of regular physical practice doesn't have to be lifting weights, although if you want to hang with me, it better be. Just kidding. But yeah, I think finding some type of regular physical practice, physical activity, just has so many positive effects on so many downstream things. And instead of looking at it as exercise, I mean, many people look at that like they look at going to the dentist. Like, I have to do this for my health, but I hate it. That's not the one for you. Find something else, whether it's intramural softball or the backstroke or something else. It doesn't matter. Just figure out what it is and do it.
Yeah. I love that. That's great.
And familiar.
I might have said that last time.
I feel like you might have said that last time. I'm not going to check.
We'll go back and see. But thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. We really appreciate it. And guys, we hope that you enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christina Fit and Marissa at Marissa Roy Fitness. Eric, where can they find you?
You can find me at the trending hashtag ban Chris Barakat. And after that, you can find me at Helms 3DMJ on Instagram, where I link out to all kinds of stuff that I'm doing at the moment, probably including this podcast. And then generally, if you want to find anything related to drug-free lifting for physique or strength, that is 3dmusclejourney.com. And then if you want to listen to me babble incessantly with Omar Isuf, check us out at Iron Culture, the podcast.com.
Awesome.
There's no .com. Just search Iron Culture Podcast. Yeah.
Awesome. So we'll have all that linked in the description. And thank you guys so much for listening. And we hope to see you back next week.